The village lay between hills of dry earth and a river that ran shallow most of the year, a place where survival demanded discipline and where tradition was enforced with an iron grip. The elders spoke often of order, of respect, and of obedience, and their word was rarely questioned. Children grew up knowing that even the smallest misstep could earn them harsh correction, and though laughter filled the days, it was a laughter weighed down by the fear of punishment. In this place, silence carried meaning, for behind every quiet glance or stern command lingered the shadow of consequences. Among the families that called the village home was a young girl, fragile in appearance yet filled with a spirit not easily broken. She was neither rebellious nor foolish, but innocence was not always protection in a community where envy and cruelty simmered just beneath the surface. Her step-family, ever keen to remind her of her lesser place, whispered lies about her clumsiness and spread tales of her supposed laziness. Children her own age copied the tone of their elders, mocking her in small ways that stung but left no visible wound. The girl bore it all in silence, carrying her chores without complaint, her eyes lowered, her lips pressed together. Yet her silence, instead of softening their view, only made her more of a target. To them, her refusal to protest made her seem weak, and weakness was a thing despised in the village of strict traditions. One evening, when the sun sank low and painted the horizon in fire and shadow, the elders gathered at the center of the village. Their council mat was spread on the ground, and their voices murmured with the weight of judgment. A false accusation had been made that the girl had disrespected her stepsister during the day, a claim crafted with venom but dressed as truth. The elders, bound more by appearances than fairness, declared that her offense could not go unpunished. They did not strike her, nor did they confine her, but instead chose a punishment meant to grind her spirit down into dust. She was to count stones until sunrise, every pebble she could gather into one place, and she was not to rest until her task was done. The announcement sent murmurs through the villagers who had gathered, for the task was cruel in its simplicity. Stones littered the ground in every corner of the village, from riverbank to field, and to count them was an impossible command. Some chuckled under their breath, taking delight in the thought of her weary body stooping again and again, lips moving in endless repetition. Others frowned, uneasy at the harshness of the decree but unwilling to voice dissent. Punishment was tradition, and tradition was to be upheld. The girl did not cry out when the command was given. Her small hands clenched at her sides, her lips trembled, but her eyes did not shed tears. She nodded once, silently, and turned toward the clearing where stones lay scattered across the earth. A cold wind passed over her as night crept in, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. The first star blinked into the sky as she knelt to begin her task, her fingers brushing over the rough edges of the stones. Behind her, the villagers dispersed, some eager to sleep, others to whisper and laugh about the punishment that had been chosen. Alone beneath the wide sky, the girl whispered the first numbers, her voice barely carrying beyond her lips. 1, 2, 3, the rhythm of her counting was swallowed by the vast silence of the night. Shadows lengthened across the ground as the moon rose high, silvering the stones and casting her small figure into sharp relief. What was meant as humiliation had begun, and with each stone she touched, she felt the weight of her village's cruelty pressing against her fragile shoulders. Yet in that moment, though no one noticed, there was something in her silence that refused to break. The night deepened, and the task stretched before her like a cruel horizon with no end. The ground was littered with stones, some smooth and small, others jagged and heavy, each one waiting to be lifted, touched, and counted. She bent low, her fingers brushing the cold earth, picking one after another, whispering the numbers beneath her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, again and again her voice quivered with the monotony. The pile she had begun to gather looked insignificant against the endless scatter of stones around her, as if the earth itself mocked her effort by birthing more with each passing moment. Her arms began to ache, her shoulders stiffened, and the skin on her fingers rubbed raw against the sharp edges, but still she continued, because to stop was to invite further shame. The villagers who had lingered nearby treated her ordeal like entertainment. From the shadows of their huts or while perched lazily by the fire, they cast sidelong glances and stifled laughter. The children whispered among themselves, mimicking her bent posture, bending low with exaggerated movements as though the punishment was a game. Some of the women shook their heads, pretending sympathy, but their eyes gleamed with satisfaction at seeing her humbled. The elders, who had decreed the task, watched in silence at intervals, their stony expressions betraying neither approval nor pity. Yet beneath their stern exteriors lay the unspoken truth. They too knew the task was impossible, and it was in that impossibility that they believed her spirit would break. Her stepfamily, however, found no need for restraint. Her stepsister stood with arms folded, her smile sharp and cruel in the moonlight, calling out mocking encouragements meant to pierce the girl's fragile endurance. "Don't lose count," she jeered, her voice loud enough for the others to hear. "You'll have to start again if you do." Laughter followed, cruel and sharp, cutting through the night air like knives. The stepmother whispered to neighbors with feigned sorrow, speaking of how lazy the girl had always been, how such lessons were necessary, planting seeds of ridicule in fertile ground. The girl, bent low with another stone in her hand, heard it all, but she gave no answer. Her silence was her shield, though it grew heavier with each passing hour. Exhaustion crept into her bones, dulling her movements, turning her counting into a slow, rhythmic chant. Sweat streaked her forehead despite the coolness of the night, mixing with dust until her face was smeared with grime. Her knees ached from kneeling, her back stiffened from bending, and still the stones stretched endlessly before her eyes. She lifted one and whispered 200, only to falter moments later, realizing she had lost track. A small gasp escaped her lips, and she bit down hard to hold back tears. Behind her, her stepsister clapped her hands in mock delight, declaring loudly that she would never finish before sunrise. The others chuckled, entertained by her misery, as though her suffering were part of the night's festivities. Still she pressed on, her hands trembling, her breath shallow, her eyes stinging with fatigue. Each stone she touched became heavier, as though it absorbed her exhaustion, as though the earth itself conspired to sap her strength. She whispered the numbers again, forcing herself to begin anew, her voice thin but unbroken. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, the moon climbing higher, and her small figure bent again and again in the pale light, an image of relentless labor. What the villagers saw as humiliation became, for her, a trial of endurance, and though her body trembled under the impossible weight of the task, her will, quiet, unseen and stubborn, refused to give in. The night wrapped itself around her like a suffocating cloak, thick with silence except for the rasp of her breath and the faint clatter of stones shifting against one another. The village fires had long dimmed, and most of the onlookers drifted away, leaving her alone in the field of scattered rocks. Yet the emptiness was no comfort. It pressed in on her, reminding her that she was abandoned, forced to face the impossible task without kindness or mercy. Her hands trembled as they brushed across the cold ground, her lips whispering numbers into the void. 1, 2, 3 for, again and again her voice faltered, swallowed by the vastness of the night. But fatigue betrayed her. After hours of counting, her mind became foggy, her words stumbling over themselves. She picked up a stone, whispering 500, only to pause, realizing she had forgotten whether she had said 497 or 498. The realization struck her like a cruel blow, her stomach tightening as despair surged. All her effort seemed wasted, and the thought of beginning again from one sent a sharp pain through her chest. For a moment she froze, clutching a stone as if it might anchor her sanity, her lips quivering with the weight of futility. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the stones into shapeless mounds. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed even in her solitude. Her stepfamily's mocking voices still lingered in her mind, cruel echoes that gnawed at her will. She could almost hear them laughing at her mistakes, delighting in her suffering, their satisfaction feeding on her misery. The ache in her back grew unbearable, her knees raw against the earth, yet she forced herself to bend again, to whisper again, to start again. 1, she murmured, as though the word itself was an act of defiance. The darkness deepened, heavy and suffocating. The moon had shifted far across the sky, its cold light spilling across her bent figure like a spotlight in a theater of despair. Shadows stretched long and haunting, and the silence of the village seemed to mock her isolation. Insects buzzed faintly in the grass, their tiny songs the only witness to her struggle. She felt as though the entire world had turned away, leaving her in this barren contest between will and exhaustion. Her body longed to collapse, to surrender to sleep, but something stronger inside her refused to bow. Her resilience did not blaze like fire, it was quieter, steadier, a flame too stubborn to be extinguished. Each stone became a promise, each number a vow whispered into the night. She would not give her stepmother the satisfaction of breaking her spirit, nor would she let the mocking villagers say she had failed. Though her lips quivered with every count, though her voice was nearly too faint to hear, she pressed on, her rhythm steadying with each repetition. 1, 2, 3, again and again her words filled the silence, fragile but unbroken. As the night wore on, the loneliness seemed to shift. It no longer pressed against her as an enemy but became a companion of sorts, a silent witness to her struggle. The stars overhead glittered faintly, like countless eyes watching from above, and she imagined that they too were counting with her, keeping her company in the endless task. The despair still gnawed at her, but beneath it ran something stronger, an unyielding current of determination that refused to let her fall. She bent once more, lifted another stone, and whispered another number, her body trembling, but her spirit standing tall against the weight of the night. Her fingers, raw and trembling, brushed against another stone, and for a moment she thought exhaustion had finally broken her mind. At first it was nothing more than a faint vibration beneath her skin, a quiver that seemed to hum from the ground itself. She paused, holding her breath, her tired eyes darting around the empty night. The village lay silent, the huts dark, the air heavy with stillness. Yet the faint hum deepened, resolving into something she had never expected. Whispers, soft and delicate, as though the stones themselves were murmuring secrets only she could hear. Her heart lurched. She pressed the stone closer to her ear, and there it was again, a voice too ancient to belong to any living soul. The sound was not one language but many, a weaving of tongues that felt both foreign and familiar, resonating deep in her chest. At first she recoiled, dropping the stone onto the ground, her breath quick and shallow. But curiosity, stronger than fear, pulled her back. She picked up another, and again the whispers stirred, rising like wind passing through reeds. "Child," she thought she heard, though the sound was more sensation than word, as if the meaning slipped straight into her spirit. The punishment that had weighed so heavily on her, counting endless stones until her body broke, now seemed to shift into something otherworldly. Each stone was no longer just a burden, but a vessel, a fragment of memory carrying echoes of those who had walked the earth before her. She closed her eyes, listening closely, and images flickered in her mind. Women grinding grain at dawn, men returning from the hunt, children laughing near the river. The stones whispered of lives long past, of suffering, of triumph, of endurance. It was as if the ancestors themselves had been watching, waiting for her touch to stir their voices awake. She trembled, torn between fear and awe. Was she imagining it all, her mind unraveling under the weight of exhaustion? Or had her suffering opened a door that others could not see? The line between reality and vision blurred, and the task that had been designed to break her spirit instead began to feel like initiation into a deeper truth. She remembered the stories told in hushed tones by the old women at the fireside, stories of stones that carried the voices of the dead, of ancestors who refused to be forgotten. Those tales had always seemed like fables to frighten children, yet here she was, living their truth beneath the pale glow of the moon. As she moved from stone to stone, the whispers grew louder, weaving together in a chorus. Some voices were heavy with sorrow, others strong with command. She felt as though they were speaking directly to her heart, telling her that her suffering was not in vain. Her stepfamily had hoped to humiliate her, to prove her weakness, but in the act of obedience she had stumbled upon revelation. Each count she uttered now felt less like submission and more like a dialogue with something eternal. The stones seemed to count her in return, acknowledging her endurance, recording her name among their countless memories. A strange calm settled over her. The despair of earlier hours gave way to a trembling reverence. She was not alone in this task, not abandoned in silence. The stones themselves bore witness, their whispers binding her to a history larger than her own pain. Her punishment had become a ritual, her suffering a bridge between the living and the dead. With each touch she felt stronger, as though the ancestors were lending her their strength, wrapping her in the quiet power of those who had endured before her. And so she continued, not merely counting but listening. Her whispers and theirs intertwined, a duet of resilience echoing into the night. The field of stones no longer felt hostile but alive, pulsing with meaning. Where others saw only cruelty, she now sensed revelation, a truth too great to be hidden, a power too ancient to be silenced. The first hints of dawn were still far away when footsteps broke the fragile rhythm of her whispering to the stones. At first she thought the ancestors' voices had grown louder, but then the sound shifted into laughter, sharp, cutting, human. She froze, clutching a stone in her hand, her heart sinking. The villagers had returned, drawn by curiosity and cruelty, eager to see if the punishment had broken her spirit. A group of children rushed forward, their giggles cruel rather than innocent. They pointed at her crouched form and mimicked her counting, exaggerating their voices in a way that turned her solemn task into a joke. 1, 2, 3. They chanted in sing-song tones, falling over in laughter when they deliberately lost their place and shouted nonsense numbers. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the stone in her palm, but their voices pressed against her ears like thorns. Behind them, A cluster of women whispered to one another, shaking their heads in mock pity. "She will never finish," one murmured loudly enough for the girl to hear. "The elders gave her an impossible task because they knew she is too weak." Another added, "By morning she will collapse, and then we will see what good comes of her stubbornness." Their words stung, not because they were true, but because they were meant to strip her of dignity before the whole village. Her stepfamily stood slightly apart, but their expressions were filled with satisfaction. Her stepmother's lips curved into a thin smile, pleased with the spectacle. And at the center of it all, her stepsister's laughter rang out the loudest, shrill and mocking. She clapped her hands together as though the whole thing were entertainment for her alone. "Look at her," she shouted. "She can't even count without losing her place. Stones are smarter than she is." Her words rippled through the crowd, feeding more laughter, turning cruelty into a game. The girl's hands tightened around the stone she held. Her palms were raw and sore, streaked with blood and dust, yet she kept her head bowed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tears. Inside, though, her chest burned. Every jeer, every whisper, every sneer settled on her shoulders like a weight heavier than the stones she was ordered to count. Yet in that weight there was also a strange clarity. Their mockery was not proof of her weakness but of their fear. They needed her to be small so they could feel powerful. Her stepsister crouched down beside her, close enough that only she could hear the venom in her voice. "Do you really think the ancestors care about you? You're nothing but a servant to these rocks. Count faster, little fool, maybe the stones will reward you." She laughed again, tossing a handful of pebbles into her lap as if to increase her burden. The girl flinched but said nothing. Instead, she touched one of the new stones and the whispers returned, softer now but steady, like a reassurance only she could hear. The villagers continued to taunt her, their amusement growing with every moment. They saw a broken girl hunched over dirt and stone, not the flicker of resilience glowing in her eyes. For them, the punishment was entertainment, a cruel distraction from their own lives. But for her, each insult only deepened her resolve. Their laughter no longer pierced her spirit the way it once had. It echoed on the surface, hollow and fleeting, while something unshakable rooted itself inside her. As the night stretched on, their mockery became a chorus, but she did not crumble. She bent lower over the stones, listening to their voices, both living and ancestral. She realized that while the villagers could only see humiliation, she was part of something far greater, something they could never understand. Their laughter would fade with the morning, but what she was learning from the stones would outlast every sneer and every cruel word. And still, her stepsister laughed the hardest, unaware that her own voice would soon echo in ways she never intended, swallowed by a dawn that would not arrive as expected. Her body swayed with exhaustion as the sky began to pale, the black of night thinning into the gray of approaching dawn. Her hands trembled with every stone she touched, her breath shallow and uneven, her back aching as though the very earth pressed against it. She had not slept, she had not eaten, and yet she continued, her fingers brushing over the cold surfaces, lips whispering numbers that blurred and tangled in her weary mind. Her eyes burned with fatigue, but she refused to close them, for closing them meant surrender. Around her, the village had grown quiet. The taunting voices that filled the night had dwindled to silence, the cruel crowd dispersing once boredom set in. Only a few stragglers lingered at a distance, watching with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Even her stepsister, who had laughed the loudest, had retreated for a time, leaving her hunched alone among the stones. Yet the silence felt unnatural, too heavy, as if the air itself waited for something. The first hints of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the edges of the world in pale orange. It touched the stones before it touched her, and in that moment she saw it, a faint shimmer as though the rocks themselves carried their own light. She blinked, certain it was her exhaustion playing tricks, but when she rubbed her eyes and looked again, the glow remained. It was subtle, like the faint breath of embers hidden beneath ashes, but it spread from stone to stone, until the ground around her seemed to pulse faintly with life. Her heartbeat quickened. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the glowing stones, and it was warm under her skin, no longer the cold hardness of the night. The whispers she had heard before rose again, clearer now, as if the dawn gave strength to the voices of the unseen. They spoke not in words she could repeat, but in meanings that pressed into her bones. Patience, endurance, awakening. The villagers who lingered shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. They rubbed their eyes, thinking the glow was a trick of the early sun, but as the light grew stronger, the stones did not fade. Instead, the stone's shimmer seemed to feed on the dawn, glowing brighter as the sun's first rays touched the village. An uneasy murmur spread, What had been a punishment now looked like a sign. The girl's head drooped, her body on the verge of collapse. Sweat matted her hair, her hands were cracked and sore, but something inside her kept her upright. Her body was weak, but her spirit, sharpened by a night of endurance, clung to the task. She whispered numbers still, her voice hoarse and ragged, even as her lips cracked with dryness. Then, as the first sliver of the sun broke fully over the horizon, the air itself shifted. A stillness so deep it pressed into the skin wrapped around the village. Birds that usually sang at dawn were silent. The wind stilled as though holding its breath. Even the villagers stopped whispering, their unease settling into fear. All eyes turned to the girl hunched among the glowing stones, the child who had been meant for humiliation. Her vision blurred, but within the blur she saw something more. The stones seemed to move in patterns, aligning themselves in her mind's eye, forming shapes and paths that hinted at secrets beyond mortal understanding. She felt both fear and awe, her exhaustion forgotten for a fleeting moment as she realized the night's torment had led her here, to this threshold of change. The coming of dawn was not an end to her suffering but a beginning of something greater. The stones, once lifeless weights of punishment, now pulsed as if they had been waiting for her endurance, her willingness to suffer through the night, to reveal their hidden truth. Something was about to change, and as the first full rays of sunlight fell upon her, even the villagers sensed that the ordinary world was about to break open. The sun lifted higher above the horizon, its golden light spilling across the village like a river of fire, but all eyes were fixed on the girl and the sea of stones surrounding her. She sat slumped, her body trembling with exhaustion, her lips cracked and raw from whispering numbers through the night. The task that had been meant to break her spirit now teetered at the edge of transformation. The stones beneath her fingertips were no longer cold and lifeless. They pulsed faintly, like the beating of a hidden heart. The villagers, who had gathered again when the strange glow began, stood at a distance, whispering nervously. Children clung to their mothers, men folded their arms uneasily, and even the elders who had declared her punishment now frowned with unease. This was not what they had expected. Punishment was supposed to crush, not awaken something unexplainable. The stepsister stood among them, her arms crossed, her smirk faltering as she noticed the way the stones shimmered under the girl's touch. The girl, dizzy with fatigue, pressed her palm flat against one of the glowing rocks. In that instant, the whispers she had heard faintly all night surged into clarity. They spoke her name, not in a single voice but in many, layered and endless, as though the stones themselves were filled with the voices of countless ancestors. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in terror and awe. The stones were not merely being counted. They were counting her. 1, whispered a stone near her hand, its voice soft but resonant, echoing in her mind. 2, murmured another, the sound rumbling beneath her knees. 3, said yet another, the vibration spreading outward like ripples in water. She looked around wildly, her heart pounding. All around her, stones lifted slightly from the ground, trembling in the dawn light, rising just enough to quiver in the air. Each one seemed to hum with recognition, with acknowledgement of her endurance. The villagers gasped. A few fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the ground, certain they were witnessing the work of spirits. Others backed away, clutching at charms or muttering prayers to ward off what they could not understand. The stepsister's smirk broke entirely, her face pale as she stumbled backward, shaking her head in disbelief. No, she whispered, but her voice was drowned by the chorus of stones. The girl could feel them now, not just hear them but feel the rhythm of their counting in her bones. It was not cruel or mocking as the villagers had been. It was solemn, reverent, as if her suffering had been weighed and her resilience recorded in a language older than time itself. She had endured the night, borne the laughter and the pain, and the stones had witnessed it all. Now they answered. The stones rose higher, some tumbling into the air and forming spirals, others clattering together to create strange patterns upon the earth. Dust lifted with them, shimmering in the light of dawn, turning the scene into something otherworldly. The girl's name rippled through the air again and again, whispered from hundreds of unseen mouths, until it felt as if the entire earth called out to her. Her exhaustion was replaced by a shuddering awe, a realization that she was no longer just a girl struggling against cruelty, she was a part of something vast, something sacred. The villagers could not look away. Some wept openly, struck by fear or wonder, while others trembled with the weight of realizing they had mocked what was now being exalted. A boy who had laughed at her the night before clutched his mother's skirt and buried his face, too terrified to meet the eyes of the girl now surrounded by living stone. The elders exchanged nervous glances, the authority in their eyes fading as they realized their punishment had unleashed forces beyond their control. The girl rose slowly, her body weak but her presence transformed. The stones shifted as she stood, forming a path beneath her feet, guiding her toward the center of the gathering. They floated around her like sentinels, their whispers carrying her name in endless rhythm, counting not stones but her very being, her strength, her pain, her endurance. She looked at the villagers, and though she did not speak, the stones spoke for her, their hum filling the silence with unshakable meaning. She had survived what was meant to destroy her, and in doing so she had become more than they had ever imagined. The stepsister's face twisted with fear and she shouted, "This is trickery." She bewitched the stones. But even her voice faltered as one of the stones drifted past her face, glowing brighter when it neared the girl. The villagers ignored her protest, for they knew this was no trick. They had all seen her labor through the night, her suffering laid bare before their eyes. No magic trick could summon the whispers of the ancestors, no deception could move the earth itself. The stone's chorus swelled, the rhythm quickening until it echoed like a heartbeat pulsing through the ground. "She is counted," the whispers seemed to say. "She is known. She is endured." The villagers clutched their chests, their fear mingling with reverence, as the impossible unfolded in front of them. The girl lifted her gaze to the horizon, the rising sun casting its golden light upon her face. Her body was frail, but her spirit glowed brighter than the dawn. She understood now that the punishment had never truly been about stones. It had been about survival, about proving that even the smallest, weakest soul could outlast cruelty and be recognized by forces greater than human mockery. And as the stones settled again, their whispers fading into silence, the village stood in stunned awe. The girl, once the object of ridicule, now stood at the center of a mystery that would be told for generations, her endurance etched into the very earth beneath their feet. The village had always lived by the certainty of rules, the weight of tradition, the iron authority of the elders. Punishments were designed to maintain order, to remind the young and the weak of their place. But on this morning, as the sun climbed higher and the stones continued to move in strange rhythms, all certainty collapsed. The people gathered in the square, their faces pale in the golden light, their eyes wide with disbelief. What they were seeing defied everything they thought they knew about their world. The elders, who had spoken with such confidence the night before, now huddled together at the edge of the crowd, whispering frantically. Their brows were furrowed, their hands trembling as they gestured toward the girl at the center. One elder, his voice hoarse with fear, muttered, "It is a curse." Another shook his head violently and replied, "No, it is the ancestors. They are speaking through her." Their voices clashed, rising with desperation, but none of them could explain what unfolded before their eyes. For all their wisdom, the moment had stripped them of authority. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, peeking out with frightened eyes. Some began to cry, their small voices carrying a sharp note of panic through the square. Women pulled their children close, their hands shaking as they muttered prayers under their breath. A few wept openly, overwhelmed by the fear that something sacred and dangerous had been awakened. Men who prided themselves on strength and courage, stood stiff and trembling. Their mouths were tight, their eyes darting toward the shifting stones as though they might spring into attack. But none dared move closer. The stones, dozens upon dozens of them, no longer lay still on the earth. They rose and hovered, circling the girl in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. At first they formed spirals that expanded outward, a breathing rhythm that pulsed with the air. Then they shifted, stacking themselves into shapes that looked like towers, only to collapse again and reform into lines and circles. With every movement, the hum of whispers filled the air, a chorus of voices so layered and deep that it seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. The whispers were no longer random. They carried meaning, warning, prophecy. The villagers strained to hear, their bodies pressed forward despite their fear, as the voices spoke of cruelty, endurance, and justice. "You who mocked the innocent," the stones seemed to murmur, "you who placed burdens upon the weak, know that the earth remembers." A wail broke from the crowd as the meaning sank in, for each villager felt the weight of guilt pressing on their shoulders. Every insult, every jeer, every harsh command given to the girl was being revealed under the rising sun. Her stepsister pushed her way through the crowd, her voice sharp with panic. "Do not listen," she shouted, her face pale and twisted. "This is her doing. She has tricked you all." But her words rang hollow, for even as she spoke, one of the stones drifted toward her and hovered at her chest, glowing faintly. The whispers grew louder, and though no one could hear exact words, the intent was clear. The stone itself accused her. She stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing in terrified silence. The girl, standing in the center of the storm, was transformed. Her body was weak, her hands bruised and torn, but her presence had shifted. She no longer bent beneath the weight of others' cruelty. The stones floated around her as if she were the axis of their orbit, their recognition lifting her from humiliation into something almost sacred. Her eyes, once downcast and afraid, now held a depth that unsettled those who met them. She did not need to speak. The stones spoke for her. The panic deepened. Some villagers fell to their knees, their hands raised in supplication. "Forgive us," one man cried, his voice breaking. "We did not know." A woman echoed him, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her child close. The air vibrated with the sound of weeping and whispered prayers. Yet others, too frightened to beg, turned and fled, rushing back toward their homes, as if distance could shield them from the strange reckoning that filled the square. The elders finally stepped forward, though their steps were unsteady. One raised his hand and tried to call for calm, but his voice cracked. "This is a trial," he stammered, glancing at his companions who nodded uncertainly. "The ancestors test us through this girl. We must not anger them further." His words only deepened the tension, for they were not commands but confessions of helplessness. The stones shifted again, their shapes aligning into a ring around the girl. Within the circle, the earth seemed to hum with energy, a vibration that could be felt through the soles of the villagers' feet. The whispers swelled into a single phrase repeated again and again, carrying on the air until it seemed to echo from the huts and the riverbank alike. Though each villager heard it differently, they all knew its meaning. She had been counted, she had been tested, and she had endured. The stepsister fell to her knees, her defiance broken. She covered her ears as if to block out the voices, but the sound was inside her head, inside her heart, impossible to silence. The girl looked at her, not with malice but with the stillness of someone who has seen beyond human cruelty. That gaze, steady and unyielding, struck harder than any punishment. The village stood in shock, their world reshaped before their eyes. The stones, once tools of humiliation, had become messengers of justice. The girl, once mocked and broken, now stood as a vessel of endurance, her name etched into the whispers of the earth. Fear and awe rippled through the people, for they knew that nothing would be the same after this dawn. The lesson of the counting stones came slowly, not as a thunderclap of sudden revelation, but as a heavy truth settling upon the hearts of every villager who had stood laughing at the girl the night before. The stones, now alive with voices and strange movements, did not scatter back into the dust of the earth. They arranged themselves in rings and spirals around her, glowing faintly with dawn's first light, and their whispers carried across the village in a chorus both haunting and undeniable. Each stone spoke in rhythm, not of numbers anymore but of judgment, as though every grain of sand within them knew what had been done in cruelty. "Mockery is heavier than stone," they intoned. "Cruelty weighs more than the earth itself." The villagers who had once sneered, now lowered their eyes, trembling at the weight of their own actions reflected back at them. The elders who had decreed her punishment felt their pride burn away into shame. They had thought the counting of stones was harmless cruelty, a spectacle to break her spirit, yet now they understood that they had mocked endurance, punished innocence, and taunted strength in its quietest form. The women who whispered against her felt their tongues turn dry, realizing that their ridicule had been recorded, not by human ears, but by the spirits embedded within the very earth they walked upon. Children who had laughed until their bellies ached now clung to their mothers, wide-eyed with fear, because the stones seemed to call out each sound of cruelty, repeating the mocking tones of their voices until they could not bear to hear themselves echoed back in that terrible chorus. Even the stepsister, bold in her ridicule, stood pale and shaken, for the stones chanted her laughter louder than all others, as though her cruelty had been the sharpest and would be remembered the longest. The girl did not gloat, nor did she raise her voice in vengeance. She stood still, her body weary, her hands trembling, her eyes hollow from the endless night, yet her silence held more power than any curse. The stones circled her, lifting into the air in a strange and beautiful rhythm, and every villager knew she had been chosen as the vessel for something greater than punishment. What they had meant to break her had only revealed her strength, and the earth itself had risen to testify in her favor. The villagers whispered among themselves that the ancestors had watched, that the land itself had spoken, and that no act of cruelty, no matter how small, no matter how masked as tradition or discipline, could escape the eyes of justice that lived in the unseen world. As the stones settled back into the ground, the earth seemed heavier beneath the villagers' feet. Their steps dragged, their hearts sank, and their shame became an invisible weight they would carry forever. They knew then that cruelty was not just an action. It was a burden, heavier than the millstones, harder than rock, and sharper than any blade. The girl, who had endured without complaint, became the mirror of their guilt and the teacher of a lesson they would pass on for generations. The counting of stones had ended, but in its place began the counting of deeds, the quiet knowledge that every act, whether of kindness or cruelty, was recorded, weighed, and one day returned. They spoke of her long after her bones had returned to the earth, long after the dust of her village had been scattered by winds and rains. The girl who once bent beneath the impossible task became a figure too large for time to swallow. Her story traveled from mouth to mouth, from fire to fire, until even distant villages carried whispers of the girl who had been commanded to count stones until sunrise. Children who had not yet seen the world outside their compound knew her name, not as a girl of flesh and sorrow, but as a figure of power wrapped in mystery. She was no longer the punished child, the scorned sister, the mocked and weary figure. She was remembered as the girl who endured when endurance seemed impossible, and at dawn, it was not she who counted the stones but the stones themselves that counted her. The elders told the story with hushed reverence, warning the young never to mock the innocent, never to burden the weak with punishments born of pride. Cruelty is heavier than stone, they would say, echoing the whispers of that dawn. When disputes arose, her tale was invoked. Do not let your hands grow light with laughter at another's suffering, mothers would tell their children, for the earth hears and the stones remember. Her name became a proverb, spoken whenever injustice appeared. Do not count the stones of the innocent, lest they rise to count you. Generations passed, yet the tale only grew. Some said the stones that had risen still rested near the edge of the village, half buried, but marked by a strange shimmer when moonlight touched them. Travelers swore that if you pressed your ear against them, you could still hear faint whispers, as though the ancestors continued to repeat the lesson for those willing to listen. Others claimed the stones would grow warm in the hands of the unjust, refusing to stay silent when cruelty lingered in a heart. Whether truth or rumor, the stones themselves became sacred, a reminder that the earth does not forget. Her stepsister, in some versions of the story, is remembered as the one who mocked the loudest, and thus carried the heaviest shame. Children grew up hearing that to laugh at another's suffering was to invite the same shame upon yourself. Her name faded into shadow, a warning rather than a legacy. Yet the girl, though once nameless in her suffering, was given honor in every telling. Some called her Daughter of Stones, others the Counted One, but all agreed that she embodied a strength beyond measure, the kind of strength that endures without hatred, that suffers without surrender, that transforms cruelty into revelation. Her tale became more than memory, it became ritual. In some villages, when children quarreled, they were sent to sit by a pile of stones until they made peace, reminded of the girl who bore the weight of countless stones in silence. At harvest festivals, a single stone would be lifted into the air before feasting began, and the story would be retold, not as entertainment but as a reminder that justice is not only human, but woven into the earth itself. The stones are watchers, they would say, and the girl was their chosen witness. And yet, the tale did not end only in warnings. It also became a source of hope. For those who felt small, voiceless, or broken beneath the weight of others' cruelty, the story was proof that endurance could call forth powers unseen. Women whispered it to daughters who felt overlooked. Fathers told it to sons who struggled with hardship. Travelers carried it across rivers and mountains, until the girl was no longer tied to one village but belonged to the imagination of many. She became a legend not bound to her own people alone, but to anyone who had ever felt the weight of injustice pressing down. Some said that at sunrise, if you sat alone with a stone in your hand and closed your eyes, you could hear her name echo faintly, carried in the breath of the earth itself. Others swore that on certain dawns, when the air was still and heavy, stones seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if counting those who passed by. Whether truth or superstition, her story made people walk more carefully upon the earth, made them weigh their actions as though each step might awaken the memory of that night. The girl who had been mocked, humiliated, and sentenced to an impossible task was no longer remembered as a victim. Her story was one of reversal, of transformation. She did not break the stones broke the silence of cruelty. She did not demand vengeance, the world itself bore witness on her behalf. She had been powerless in the eyes of men, yet powerful in the eyes of the unseen. And so she lived on, not through monuments or wealth, but through the tale that clung to the bones of time itself. Even now, when fires burn low and the stars scatter across the sky, storytellers still raise their voices and begin. There was once a girl who was told to count stones until sunrise, and children lean closer, listening with wide eyes, waiting for the moment when the stones begin to count her instead. The air grows heavy in that pause, and even the grown listen with unease, reminded that cruelty is never forgotten, that the earth itself keeps its own record. Thus her legacy endures, not only as a warning carved into memory, but as a light for the weary, a strength for the voiceless, and a reminder that even in silence, endurance can move the very stones beneath our feet. She became more than a girl, she became a lesson, a legend, a symbol etched into both earth and story, the girl who was counted.